Hi, welcome all. We're just going to take a moment to let some more folks filter in, but thank you for joining our virtual webinar today. This is a webinar about the resources for historic religious property owners in both New York and Connecticut state. So we'll just take a few more moments to let some people find their way in. And go ahead and feel free if you have any technology questions to pop them into the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that and we can go ahead and answer things if you have any tech specific questions right now. We are also recording this webinar, so if you have folks that you know of that want to attend late or weren't able to make it today, we will be sending out a recording, and we will also be posting it to our YouTube video, so feel free to return back to that recording in the aftermath or to let people know to find us on YouTube. I think our YouTube channel is Partners for Sacred Places, but it does seem like our participants are plateauing, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining this webinar today. We're going to be talking about resources for historic religious property owners in New York and Connecticut. We have some wonderful guest speakers here with us today. Your moderators are going to be me, Maddie Hinson. I'm a development associate here at Partners for Sacred Places. And then we also have Kevin Block, who's our director of special initiatives here in the Philadelphia office. Many of you might know him through the Thriving, let me see if I can get this right, Thriving Parish Cooperative Parish Initiatives, TCPI, which I believe many of you are finding your way to this webinar through some of those newsletters. But to give you an introduction about Partners, for those of you who aren't exactly familiar with our work, we're the only national non-sectarian nonprofit organization dedicated to the sound stewardship and active community use of America's older and also historic sacred places, purpose-built sacred places, we also like to say. And if that kind of sounded like a mouthful to you, you can just remember that we're at the intersection of faith, heritage, and community. So if any of those things are relevant to you, we probably have some kind of offering that we can provide help or resources about. And if you'd like to follow us to learn more, you can scan any of those QR codes. That means you're going to hold up your phone to those weird pixelated things. There should be a pop-up that will lead you to our Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, respectively. We have our website there at the bottom. Feel free to send an email to either Kevin, me, or the General Partners for Sacred Places email if you have any questions. And you can kind of read through some of the things we offer once you sign up for our newsletter. You can find more information about webinars, grant opportunities, trainings. You can find our past recordings. We also have some fun competitions like our Faith Inform Awards, which I believe we're in the decision round right now. Our jury is deliberating today about who has won the 2025 awards. We have a magazine, Sacred Places, and you can also just find inspiring and relevant news stories from really around the country about historic sacred places. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin now to go over the Thriving Cooperative Parish Initiative.
Thanks, Maddie. So the immediate motivation for this webinar was to provide additional resources via our connections to these local preservation advocacy experts, which I will be introducing in a second here. I'm the project lead at Partners for the Thriving Cooperative Parish Initiative, which is a Lilly Endowment funded project that went through the New York Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, as well as the United Methodist City Society. Actually, that project is where I learned that the New York Annual Conference included churches in Connecticut. So I thought, okay, this isn't a New York project. There's also some important Connecticut resources out there that we want to share with all of the participants in this project, as well as anyone else who could benefit. So actually, Michael, Caitlin, Stefan, Colleen, they're going to talk about resources that are available to any historic religious property owner in these states. So everyone's included. This is a project that's ongoing. We just wrapped up the first cohort. We'll start a second cohort in 2026. You can see the distribution here in the map. We started out in Hartford, Connecticut. We were upstate, up the Hudson. We were on Long Island in the boroughs. So we thought, let's convene experts from all of these different regions. And you can go to the next slide. Those experts are Michael Forino from Preservation Connecticut, Director of Preservation Partnerships, and Stefan Danczuk, Service and Program Coordinator for Preservation Connecticut. Colleen Heemeyer from the Director of Sacred Sites Program for the New York Landmarks Conservancy. And then lastly, from the Preservation League of New York State's Director of Preservation, Caitlin Meives. So with that, this is the order we're going to go through. You can see that you have a Q&A function in your Zoom chat, and you can drop questions in there as we go. And afterwards, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes to go through the questions.
Okay. Is that showing up for everyone?
It looks good, not full screen, but there you go.
How about now?
Perfect.
Yeah, good, great. Well, thanks, Kevin and Maddie, for inviting Preservation Connecticut to speak at this webinar. My name is Mike Forino. I'm the Director of Preservation and Partnerships at Preservation Connecticut. I'm joined by my colleague, Stefan Danczuk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Preservation Connecticut is, what we do, and then I'll go over the various statewide opportunities that houses of worship may apply for. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with our organization, let me provide a brief overview. We are the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization in Connecticut. We were established in 1975 as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, and many people still know us by that name. This is a picture of our office. It was once a boarding house for single working men for Eli Whitney's Armory in New Haven and Hamden, Connecticut. And our team of 9 preservation professionals work every day to preserve, protect, and promote buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the vitality and heritage of Connecticut communities. And this is our 50th anniversary year as well. So Preservation Connecticut, as you'll find out, offers its own grants and various technical assistance programs. But one of our most well-known programs, and one that might be most useful to churches and other religious organizations, is our Circuit Rider program. Circuit Riders are essentially Preservation Connecticut's field staff. We conduct over 200 on-site visits and consultations annually with owners of everywhere from historic homes, developers, municipalities, nonprofits, religious organizations, and other cultural institutions. They facilitate community organizing efforts and advocacy efforts. They provide direct assistance and support to applicants for grant programs that aren't our own, such as through the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, which I'll talk about in a second. We provide educational events and other resources as well. And last year, we helped secure about $1 million in nonprofit funding for both churches and other organizations across the state. In that same vein, Preservation Connecticut also offers a technical assistance consultancy. These are for structural inspections, architectural analysis, or other specialized technical services. These are typically under $3,000. This is a program that's aimed to provide immediate assistance for organizations that have safety concerns regarding their buildings, organizations that need a second opinion, temporary recommendations, or who need additional information for funders. As an example, I was telling Kevin that I just came from a church in New London, Connecticut. I was up in a steeple into the spire, which has some structural issues in the city. Well, in any case, we're using this program to get a second opinion about the stability of the tower. So that's one example. Then I'll talk about funding sources specifically. So there are various funding sources that projects can tap into to complete their initiatives. I've listed some here, and I'll discuss them in more detail. Actually, I'll go through them really quickly. The big ones that I'd want you to know are Preservation Connecticut's own. We have a capital grant program that's specific to houses of worship. It's called a maintenance and repair grant for religious properties. It's currently closed this year. We do hope it will open again next year. It's a small grant program. It's $15,000 for, it's a $15,000 matching grant for, as I said, capital repairs, usually exterior work, roof work, painting, things of that nature. There's also the two SHPO sources that I'll talk about in more detail. One's called the Survey and Planning Grant Program, and the other is called the Historic Restoration Fund. And then in Connecticut, there are various community foundations, depending on your area. Connecticut Food Share, if you had food pantries, they may be able to offer assistance. And I would encourage, our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, and I'd encourage any congregation to reach out to us to talk about sources that might be more specific to your congregation. But I will say that the main three sources, so that's Preservation Connecticut's Maintenance and Repair Grant Program, and the two grant programs that are offered through the State Historic Preservation Office. They require that the building be listed on Connecticut's State Register of Historic Places or the National Register of Historic Places. And Connecticut has this really new and nice tool for congregations to be able to look up by their address. It's you can see the address here, concrist.ct.gov. This will let you know if your property is listed, as I said, both on the state register and the National Register of Historic Places. So Preservation Connecticut, again, just a little more detail, offers that annual maintenance and repair grant for historic properties. So it started in 2017. We disperse between $50,000 and $80,000 a year, and we've awarded just under $300,000 in that time. And it's the projects represent a really wide array of religious organizations. Here in the center is a 20th century modern synagogue called the Congregation Michigan Israel, which I believe Partners has funded a project there as well. On the right is the Full Gospel Interdenominational Church, which is actually a religious organization church that occupies a former historic theater. So we will fund religious, religiously owned buildings that aren't necessarily houses of worship. And on the left is a small community chapel called Pitt's Chapel in New Haven. So most good preservation projects start with planning, and in Connecticut, we're fortunate enough to have a planning grant through our State Historic Preservation Office. It's called the Survey and Planning Grant. It's a, again, matching program of up to $20,000, and it covers things like if a building is not listed on the state or national register, it could potentially cover that to make the buildings eligible for funding. Historic structures reports, feasibility and adaptive reuse studies, condition assessments, and architectural plans and specifications. And Mary Dunn is the administrator of that program. Her email is at the bottom. But of course, if, we often, as I said in the beginning, will help applicants through that process. So you can feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in that program. And then the capital program offered by the State Historic Preservation Office is called the Historic Restoration Fund. Again, this is for 501c nonprofits, municipalities, and religious organizations are counted among them. Those grants are for $500,000 to $200,000, and they're one-to-one matching projects. They are reimbursement grants, meaning that the church would need to pay for the projects up front and they would be reimbursed. But Erin Fink is the administrator of that grant program, and her email is at the bottom. But as I said, we very frequently work with applicants to that program as well. Kevin, how am I doing on time? Okay.
You're doing great. Yeah, another 5 minutes would be great, or a little longer is fine too.
Then I'll talk a little bit about one of Preservation Connecticut's own projects. So there is other funds through the state that are available, bond funding. There's one bond funded program called the Community Investment Fund. Right now, that's a program that's targeted at community projects in historically marginalized communities. So Preservation Connecticut actually has partnered with 5 churches on the east side of Bridgeport, Connecticut, to do a capital project. Here you could see the churches here. They're all different denominations. They're all within a very small geographic area, which makes the project really interesting. We're hoping very impactful. These are churches, like most churches, that do a lot for their communities, addiction services, food pantries, things of that nature, housing in some cases. So I give this example as kind of a creative way that churches may be able to kind of band together to work on potentially larger capital projects. And I'm always interested in talking to folks if they have an idea for a larger project like this. There are also some other projects, I believe, that are funded through this program for religious organizations that are developing affordable housing initiatives, for example. So they're not necessarily only for houses of worship. So, and I'll just also point out that these aren't strictly preservation projects, or I should say, Preservation Connecticut's project is not strictly preservation. We're also doing things like kitchen remodels, ADA accessibility, mechanical upgrades to make these places more accessible for folks that need the services of the churches the most. So thanks again for having us. That's our contact information. I'm assuming Kevin will send that out as well. So thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Michael. That was excellent. If we continue on and Michael has to drop off because of another responsibility, I believe Stefan will stay with us, can answer questions. So please, again, use the Q&A feature if you're interested in any of the great resources that Michael just discussed. With that, we will let Colleen take the baton and run the race here.
Going to unmute myself, and I'm assuming everybody can see my slideshow. I'm Colleen Heemeyer. I work for the New York Landmarks Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization mostly based in New York City, but the program I direct, the Sacred Sites program, works statewide throughout New York State to assist historic houses of worship with exterior restoration projects. And here we have Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church, which is located in Brooklyn. They also received partners funding to help with tower restoration.
That looks like Bridget Fiddler.
Yes, Bridget is right there. Okay, I'm having trouble. There we go. So just to give some background on our grants, we've been around since 1986. And since that time, we've given 14.7 million away to 877 grantees. And we've calculated that we've leveraged almost $1 billion in repair and restoration and construction funding and jobs throughout the state. And then recently we started looking at digging deeper into our grant impact and realized that 78% of our regranting dollars happen in what New York State determines to be high poverty areas or high qualified census tracts. And it's not just about the building, it's about how the buildings are used. So we've started asking our grant applicants, in addition to worship, what other activities are you housing in your building and how many people do you think are served by each? And have figured out in the past decade that our grantees in these high poverty areas have reached over 1 million people. We got our start in the mid 1980s when there was a serious effort to exempt religious buildings from local landmark designations in New York City. And potentially that might spread statewide. New York City has some of the toughest local landmarking regulations in the nation. And I think I'm just going to spend like 3 seconds clarifying the difference between National Register listing and local landmark designation. Local landmark designation is the type of designation that comes with the design review, where people can say, no, you can't replace your slate roof with asphalt, or you can't put vinyl windows in. Whereas National Register listing is just a pat on the back, and in most cases, that says you have a historic building, we love that, and we're going to put you on a list. So they're for the most part, and I just want to speak for New York State because I know there's something in Connecticut where if you want to demolish a National Register building, you can file to stop that. So I'm just speaking about New York State here. So, and there's Andrew Dolkart speaking at the State House about an initial survey that was conducted by the New York Landmarks Conservancy, talking about what the impacts of this exemption would be. And out of that grew our Sacred Sites program. So here's a map of all of our grants in the almost 40 years of our history. We've given grants in 61 of 62 counties, although we received a grant inquiry from Cattaraugus County about a month ago. So I'm hoping that we're going to finally have 62 out of 62 counties in the January grant round. But I put this slide up here because the blue areas of New York State are what are determined to be qualified census tracts, meaning there's a higher level of poverty. So basically you can follow the New York Thruway across most of the state and really see that outside of the urban areas, there is a lot of poverty in New York State. So it makes sense that our grants would be heavily represented in these high poverty areas. And when we look at our grants statewide, the biggest grant obviously is Manhattan. That's the lower red. And then we have Brooklyn, which is also known as the Borough of Churches. So that makes sense. But most of our grants are spread out, throughout the rest of New York's counties. So 50 counties get almost half of our grants. Ann Friedman, who is the former Sacred Sites director, used to joke that Episcopalians are our best customers, but United Methodists, you guys are third, and maybe through this program we'll get some more grant applicants from UMC conferences throughout New York State. But when we do these statistics, we realize that Episcopalians were some of the first denominations in the state, so they have the oldest buildings. They've had a head start on designations to be eligible for our program, but others are catching up, and I encourage that. In addition to our matching grants, which are probably our most popular part of this program, we've also presented at conferences to talk about adaptive reuse. And we've just finished up a multi-phase survey of religious buildings throughout the 5 boroughs. This was started in response to a wave of closures that the Roman Catholic Archdiocese in New York was conducting. And when we reached out to the Archdiocese and said, we think you have a lot of historic buildings that you're closing, they said, oh, really? Do we? Which ones? And we had to say, oh, no, we don't know. So it started as an effort to map the universe of historic Catholic churches in Manhattan, and that spread to the other boroughs. And then it started with a synagogue survey, and that spread to other boroughs. And we just finished up with Protestant denominations in the Bronx. And we had 2 graduate student interns working this summer to survey about 100 churches located in the Bronx. And the results of this are identifying buildings that have potential National Register eligibility. And when funding and time allows, we take those eligible sites and turn them into nominations. So we've listed several buildings through the course of this survey on the National Register, which makes them eligible for not just our matching grant funding in New York State, but also can leverage significant state grant funding. And this is a great example of this. This is St. Anselm's Church in the Bronx. If you see on the left, they had a deteriorated, enormous copper dome that was leaking into the sanctuary. They were able to leverage significant state funding through New York State. And New York State has a loophole where the state preservation grant program can't be used to fund a preservation project outright for a religious building, but it can be used to help fund the quote unquote restoration costs of a building. And what that means is, I'm going to make up some numbers and I'm going to keep them easy because I'm a preservationist, not a mathematician. Let's say this is $1 million copper dome replacement. But we know that if you just put EPDM roof on, it could be $200,000. So the restoration cost of using the historic material here is $800,000. So theoretically, the state could provide a grant to help support that $800,000 restoration cost. And that's what happened here. So the state helped fund the restoration costs of restoring the copper dome, and we helped some with a grant towards the project as well. Same with First Ukrainian Assembly of God, the Cornerstone Church. Also, this is in Manhattan. They were coming to us for some mansard repairs, but also were able to leverage a state grant fund to get more funding. So I would say in New York State, those are the 2 for religious buildings. Those are the 2 sources, major sources of funding, with the caveat that New York State funding is incredibly competitive. They're looking at what are you doing in addition to, what are you doing to be an economic generator? And it's really hard to argue for a church or a religious building being an economic generator when you're also competing with other types of nonprofits and other community activities. But that's neither here nor there for this presentation. And finally, we have our Sacred Sites Open House. So we started this in celebration of the Sacred Sites program 30 years ago. 30th anniversary, I'm sorry, 10 years ago. And we're going. It's usually the 3rd weekend in May. And it's a chance, we invite our grantees and we invite other interested sites to open their doors one weekend a year so that people can look at your art and architecture and get a sense of the community activities that a site provides, in the same way that when we go to Europe, we go and tour churches. I was in Paris in August, and of course, I went to Notre Dame, and of course, I went to Chartres. So we say New York State has beautiful art and architecture as shown through its religious buildings. Why can't we do that here? We estimate there's about 10,000 visitors a year that take part in this. We have anywhere from 80 to 100 sites spread out through the state. If you apply for a grant from us, we're going to do a site visit. So this is St. Stephen's United Methodist Church up in the Bronx, where we were working with them on some facade issues and foundation issues. And this is an upstate church near Syracuse, where we looked at, I believe, some masonry work. And just to give you an example, this was our most recent round of funding in June. We gave 15 grants to 15 sites that totaled just about $250,000 for these sites. To be eligible for one of our grants, you need to be either listed on the National State Registers of Historic Places, either individually or as part of a district, or listed locally pursuant to a local landmarks ordinance. Sometimes these designations run concurrently, sometimes they don't. If you have any questions about the National Register status of your site, New York State has a similar website like Connecticut, known as New York State's CRIS system, where you can look that up. You can also just call me and I can help you with that if that's a question for you. We've recently had some questions about whether or not a site is eligible if they have a proclamation from their town that says this is an old building and we love them. And generally, no, that's not what makes a site eligible. It's those two types of designations. That's all I have to share. So we've reached the end, and I'll stop sharing my screen about that. I don't know if there's any, I don't know if now is the time for questions for New York State or keep going to the end.
That's good. We're going to go to Caitlin, and then we'll take all the questions together. Thanks, Colleen.
Great. Bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. Okay. Can I just get a thumbs up, Kevin or Maddie? Are you seeing not my notes, but the actual slides? Okay, good. Always fun when you're showing folks your notes so you don't forget what you're gonna say. So also, my name is Caitlin Meives. I'm with the Preservation League of New York State. Before I get started, I just want to apologize and warn you ahead of time. I'm getting over some kind of cold something, so I may suddenly start coughing or sneezing. If I do, I will endeavor to mute myself, and I apologize in advance. So I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you, Kevin, for inviting us. So you all just heard from Colleen with the New York Landmarks Conservancy. So just to make things as confusing as possible, there are a lot of preservation nonprofit organizations in New York State. We are the preservation nonprofit organization that serves all of New York State. And of course, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, as you just heard, they serve New York City, but then they also have a statewide grant program. So it gets really confusing, and we all kind of have similar names. So don't worry if you forget, you can always just reach out to myself and or Colleen, and we can always get you pointed in the right direction. And Colleen and I, know each other. It's a very small world here in preservation, so it's all good. So what I want to do today is in the next few moments is just kind of give you a general sense of who the league is, how we can help you if you're in New York State, and then really encourage you to reach out to me to have a chat, to brainstorm, possibly to come visit your property. So just to give you a general sense, the Preservation League, again, we serve all of New York State. We have a few grant programs, which I will touch on. We do preservation advocacy at the local, state, and national level. We provide technical assistance, which I'll touch on as well. We collaborate with our other preservation nonprofit colleagues across the state. We have a statewide excellence awards program. We have a statewide program that draws attention to at-risk historic sites, and we do a lot of virtual programming as well, which you might be interested in tapping into. So again, my name is Caitlin Meives. I'm the Director of Preservation at the League. I am based in Western New York. We're a mostly remote staff of 7. So I'm in Rochester in Western New York. My other colleague who you should be aware of is Jana Rudler. She manages our grants programs, but then also handles any kind of inquiries. Jana and I together handle any kind of inquiries that might come in from folks like yourselves via email or phone. So we are both resources that are available to you should you have any New York State-based preservation questions. So these are the programs that our small staff operates. I want to quickly touch on just a few of them. We have our grants program, our 7 to Save Endangered Properties program. I'm going to touch on our colleagues. I'm going to touch on our preservation colleagues program and technical services. So most of our grant programs, unfortunately, historic houses of worship are not going to be eligible for most of our funding sources. More of what we're going to be able to do is point you to resources like Colleen, Colleen's Sacred Sites program, and that state grant program she mentioned are really going to be your go-to as historic houses of worship. But we do have a new-ish capital projects grant program called the Preservation Opportunity Fund, or POF. These are relatively small grants that we give out once a year. They range in size from $10,000 to $40,000 and really tend to be more like $10,000 to $20,000. And so it's a relatively small dollar amount, but we all know that every little bit helps. It is available to 501c3 organizations and municipalities. Again, I will say that this is a statewide grant program that has a relatively small pot of funding because it's pretty new. So I'll just say it's a very competitive program, and unless we happen to have another pot of money that we can bring to bear, we're typically awarding, maybe 2 or 3 projects per year at this point. So very competitive. We do also have another endowed grant program where we give out 1 grant per year. It's a relatively small amount that can fund pre-construction work or bricks and mortar capital repair work. That's our Donald Stephen Gratz Preservation Services Fund. This is a grant program that's by invitation only, open to nonprofits and municipalities. We do tend to prioritize projects in the Utica area. We don't often fund historic houses of worship, but especially if you're in the Utica area, it's worth being aware of. And just something to have on your radar. Wanted to at least mention it. And I also wanted to mention our 7 to Save program. This is a list of 7 sites across New York State that we announce every other year. And it's a way for us to draw attention and resources to endangered historic sites throughout the state. Historically, we don't often have a lot of houses of worship on it. However, our current class has 2 that are kind of that are related to religious properties. So number 1 there that you see is the Guild House in Albany. And this is actually an ancillary building attached to the cathedral in Albany that has been vacant for decades, that the church is actually going to rehab for a new use that serves a very underserved community. But it's really at the tipping point where if they don't invest a lot of money real soon, it could be too far gone. So we're drawing attention to that because we love to see adaptive reuse of these ancillary buildings that go along with houses of worship. And then we also have a New York City church, the Church of the Mediator in the Bronx, on our 7 to Save list this year. And this is just a way for us to draw attention to places that are endangered and could use a little signal boost and some extra support from our staff. We will be running nominations for that program. It runs every other year, so we will be opening up nominations again in 2026 for our 2027 and 2028 list. So might be something to have on your radar if you're in New York State. I also wanted to mention our preservation colleagues. So we are really lucky in New York State. So the League, again, we serve all of New York State. We're the statewide nonprofit, but we're really lucky that we have a lot of local and regional preservation nonprofit organizations sprinkled throughout the state. So I definitely encourage you, if you are a congregation in New York State, reach out to me. And I can get you in touch with whoever those local or regional nonprofits might be if you aren't already in touch with them. I will say there are a few regions that unfortunately aren't really covered by a local or regional organization. The Hudson Valley is one of them. So we try and fill in the gaps in the regions where there isn't necessarily a local colleague organization, but they are an excellent resource. And part of our role as the statewide is when we hear from folks out in communities is to connect them with those local colleagues because they really know the most about their local regional communities. And then the thing that I really want to focus on is our technical services program. And this is just basically a fancy way of saying that at the League, one of our major roles is to kind of be your old building 911 or resource center. So if you've got an old building of any type, pick up the phone, shoot us an email, and we'll try and help you in whatever way we can. Most of our resources, I mentioned we do have a few grant programs, but most of our resources are really informational and human-based. We can connect you with consultants, whether it's a grant consultant, a preservation consultant, an architect, maybe even contractors in your region. We can give you some kind of basic technical advice about what needs your building might have, or advice about fundraising. We can brainstorm creative ideas for fundraising or getting people into your building. We even can do site visits. I mentioned that we're kind of sprinkled across the state, and I do travel. New York is a big state, I have realized since taking this job 2 years ago, but I do get all over the state. So please again reach out and we can have a Zoom and look at possibly visiting in person. But really what we try to do is what I call preservation matchmaking, is connect you with those professionals or with similar congregations that maybe could provide inspiration or resources or lessons learned, or connect you with folks like Colleen who have money to give. So that's really what we're here for, is to just be a resource. You might not even know what questions you have, and that's okay. You can, pick up the phone or shoot me an email and we can kind of just go from there. I find, Kevin had asked me to kind of think about some maybe case studies that I could chat about, with congregations that I've worked with in New York State. And, in thinking about kind of I've been here at the League for 2 years, but I've been doing preservation in New York State for 15 years. And, as I thought about it, there weren't a lot of congregations I could think of where I've had sustained ongoing communication over the years. What I've found is a lot of times when I was doing local work here in Rochester for the local nonprofit, folks would call us, they've got, let's say a leaking roof. We go out, meet with them, talk about their issue, the problems that they've got with their building, and give them some ideas of fundraising, and then we might never hear from them again, which is certainly understandable because you all are trying to do a lot with your religious mission, and then trying to keep a building up is a whole other additional challenge, a whole other world that can be really overwhelming. But what I want to encourage and maybe plant the seed is, reach out to your local regional preservation organization, reach out to us at the League, and try and have like an ongoing relationship. Because I find no matter what kind of historic site, property, nonprofit, municipality we're working with, the folks who stay in regular communication, we're able to provide the best support because we've got you kind of top of mind, and maybe we think of a funding source that pops up and we're like, oh, that would be perfect for these folks. Oh, or I've got this great idea that's perfect for this congregation in blah, blah, blah community. So that's where we can really be of the most assistance, and we can kind of develop that relationship and kind of be just kind of in semi-regular communication. I find that really helps any type of organization. And then this is just to give you kind of a sense. We do get all over the state. So all of those stars are the places that we have visited, our staff, various staff have visited in the last fiscal year. So don't think that you're, too far away for us to get to you if you'd like to talk about a site visit. And then I just wanted to mention one religious property that I worked with out here in Western New York. This is the Port Gibson United Methodist Church. It's in Ontario County, about 30-40 minutes east of Rochester. This is a tiny unincorporated hamlet. Population is less than 500. And this church is really, there are very few buildings and really no gathering places in this rural community. So this church, serves not just a religious function, but it's very much like the heart of the community and really the only physical community gathering space. So they reached out to me at my prior organization that I worked for in 2020. I did a site visit in the fall of 2020 to kind of talk to them about some of the issues that they were seeing pop up with some of the maintenance issues they were seeing pop up with their building. 20 years prior, they had, I think, gotten some sacred sites money to do some work on their sanctuary windows and their spire. But now they were like, all right, we're seeing some more issues pop up and we know we have to deal with them. So I connected them with a preservation architect. And side note, if you can find an architect who knows old buildings and works with them and specializes in them, that's like gonna be a huge golden ticket to setting you up for success. And that's one of the things that we can help with is connecting you with folks in your area who do this type of work. So anyway, they connected with a preservation architect, and in the last 4 or 5 years, they've done a building condition report, they've gotten a sacred sites grant, and they've done some private fundraising. They did some masonry work, they repaired their front steps, they did some touch-ups on the steeple, and they reconstructed their ADA ramp that you see in that picture there on the bottom right. And now, I just learned this weekend, they are actually receiving a preservation award from our local preservation nonprofit colleagues. So yes, yay for them, yay for Sacred Sites for funding the work. But this is a really great success story. And, I think it just goes to show that even if you're in a very small community with very few resources and very few people to tap into, it can be done. And there's lots of great success stories out there to take inspiration from. And then I just wanted to mention a couple of resources that may be of interest. New York does have a New York statewide preservation conference every year that we are a partner on. This year's, or I should say, the 2026 conference is going to be in Cooperstown in April. There often is a session or two related to religious properties, but I would encourage you, it's a great, if you've got old buildings that you're working with, it's just a great opportunity to kind of get more immersed in this strange and wonderful world of historic preservation and meet people face to face. There's really nothing better than kind of meeting these grant funders face to face and putting, shaking hands with them and making that personal connection. So definitely encourage you to consider attending that. And then at the League, we do have a robust digital programming schedule. If you want to learn more about historic preservation in general, we have Preservation Book Club, and then we do various what we call the Future of Preservation webinars that we'll be announcing that programming for 2026 soon. So just something to be aware of and check out if you're interested in learning more about preservation and connecting with the field. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you for having us, for listening. And please, if you're in New York State, please don't hesitate to reach out. Even if you don't know what questions you have, you know, even if nothing else, for us to just kind of know that the other person exists is worthwhile. So thanks.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was great. Thanks to all of the panelists. I thought we might start as people write their questions in the chat. I know some of these questions have been answered in the Q&A, but I still think it's valuable to address them. And so, Stefan, also to hear from you, Reverend Jane Rowe asked this question about if a church wanting to make changes to the interior of the sanctuary, such as replacing pews, more flexible seating. We get this type of question a lot. Would it impact the eligibility of the congregation to receive historic preservation funds? If you could address that specific question, and this oftentimes confusing issue about interior and exterior, that'd be really helpful. And if anyone else wants to weigh in, I think everyone in the audience could benefit.
Yeah. So, you know, it's kind of one of those preservation principles that we talk about with changing the integrity of a building, right? So churches were built with these pews. And depending on the funding sources, some funding sources won't allow that level of adaptive reuse if you're going specifically for preservation funding. But if you're getting your funding from a different source, say like state bonding or something like that, or from one of these community organizations, then there's definitely there's more leeway with those kind of things of allowing, I'll say, different interpretations of the integrity. So we have not funded any projects like that in the past. I don't think it's something that we would necessarily outright say no to, but it is one of those priority things where if there's other priorities, especially, you know, if you have damaged windows or a leaking roof, you know, we're gonna want to look at those instead of replacing pews for comfort.
Yeah, and we don't fund interior work. So our grants are focused on the exterior. And like Stefan said, we also like to prioritize our funding. So many years ago, I visited a church in Troy. They were coming to us for a stained glass grant. They had a window that had been damaged through vandalism. And as I was there, I said, well, I see that the window is damaged, but your tower's kind of doing this. Like, what's going on? They said, well, yeah, we know, and it's gotten a little worse in the last couple of years, and we don't know what to do about it. And I said, well, I can help you with a grant for a structural engineer to look at the tower and see what was going on. And to cut to the chase, they got a grant from us to do the structural investigation, which discovered that the whole tower was basically being held in place and supported by one bolt. So I don't understand how, at that point I would have said, you know, we're just going to close the church until we get this fixed. But they repaired the tower, which was great. And then we didn't forget about their window. So we said, you know, you can come to us every 3 years for another grant. If you haven't repaired this in the next 3 years, please come back to us for more stained glass. They did actually fix that window, but they came back to us for another window in the church. So I you know, yeah, prioritizing is important. And I would say that 95% of my work, and probably everyone here can attest to this, is keeping water out of buildings. So if you don't have a roof, it doesn't matter what condition your windows are in, because they're not going to be around for much longer. And working from top to bottom, or maybe from the foundation up if you have some structural issues.
Thanks, Colleen. Caitlin, I really appreciate your emphasis on maintaining a continuing relationship with your local organization, whoever that might be. I'm struck thinking about, Michael, that food pantry grant. That's a great example. It'd be easy to overlook that opportunity. Maybe could you just talk a little bit about that special grant? That's the type of thing that keeping in touch with Preservation Connecticut might really benefit one of the congregations in attendance.
Yeah, so we use that as an example, as a real world example of a church coming to us asking about various grants, and us helping this particular church apply to a Connecticut Food Share grant. So this was there's actually one of those churches in Bridgeport before we launched that larger project. They have limited funds, but they had a series of refrigerators that they used for a grocery distribution that had gone bad. And they also needed a new boiler. So it was kind of a choice between, keeping heat in the building, which is also, really important for maintenance, and for use of the building, or having these new refrigerators. So we were able to identify a grant to do the refrigerator so that they could use the small amount of funds that they had to pay for the boiler. So in some ways we think of, other grants as alleviating concerns so that the congregations could then spend money on more preservation focused projects. Probably boiler, not really what we think of as preservation, but it's a really high priority for us through our maintenance and repair grant program, the small $15,000 grant. We've funded a number of boilers to make sure, churches can get through the winter with pipes bursting and things like that. So we try to think creatively about, the types of grants that will fit into the larger vision of nonprofits or congregations.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at Lawrence C. Jones Jr.'s question about high staircases at entrances, and I think the question is really speaking to any resources related to physical accessibility. So it could be stairs, certainly, but anything else that comes to mind to the panelists related to accessibility.
Well, we unfortunately don't fund accessibility. So Caitlin had shown that picture of Port Gibson, and we funded masonry work at that building. But I remember one of their other priorities was replacing the ramp into the sanctuary, and I'm glad that they were able to do that. Sometimes we can help fund planning for that type of work, architectural work, through our grant program. In limited cases, for example, there was a church in Brooklyn where we helped reconstruct, restore the facade of the church. And as part of that restoration, there were some barrier-free modifications made to the grading in front of the church and to one threshold. So it was part of the project, but it was a minor part of the project. So we considered that our grant funding was really funding like every other part of that project except the accessibility, and our funding is so limited anyway that the scale of that portion of the project didn't mean it was purely an accessibility project. That makes sense.
And then just to add to that, excuse me, setting aside the money issue, which I know is a large one, I think that's where I would just make another plug too, to really try and connect with a design professional like an architect who has experience working with older buildings, where they can really come up with a creative and functional solution for accessibility. You'd be surprised at what solutions, a good architect can come up with that, serves your community, serves your congregation, and still respects, the historic architecture of the building. So just a plug for good design and, hooking up with a really good design professional.
Right. And I'll also make a plug that I know you all don't have limitless amounts of money, but sometimes it does make sense to spend $10,000, $20,000 upfront to make sure that your $250,000, $500,000 project, those funds are being used in the most efficient way possible.
Thanks, Colleen. This is a question from Pastor Andrea Davidson, who's one of our TCPI participants in Connecticut. So she's wondering about the benefits related to historic designation and also the possible drawbacks of pursuing historic designation, thinking about the trade-offs if they exist, specifically in Connecticut, but certainly it could be useful information to folks in New York. So maybe after Michael and Stefan weigh in, Caitlin and Colleen, you can also think if there's anything to add related to their local New York context.
Yeah, in Connecticut, state register listing is totally honorary, as is national register listing, except for one case, as Colleen pointed out. Connecticut is unique, I believe, in that we have our Connecticut Environmental Protection Act counts buildings that are listed on the state register or the national register as being in the public interest. So a private party could theoretically bring suit to an organization that is unreasonably demolishing a building on the national register. That's a pretty rare occurrence, I would say, in Connecticut. But otherwise, state and national register listings are honorary, and they set you up so that you can be eligible for the funding both through our office and the State Historic Preservation Office. That's the biggest benefit. A lot of churches we work with are already listed on the state or national register and may not know it. So, reaching out to us or checking out that website that I had shared earlier is a great idea.
So Michael, if I could just follow up quickly, why is it so often the case that eligibility for these funds require either a determination of eligibility or listing? Why do they always do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think more of maybe a philosophical one. So some of our other funding through other sources that aren't related to historic or through for religious organizations aren't tied specifically to state or national register funding. I think it's really dependent on the source of the funding. In the case of our funding through the State Historic Preservation Office, listing on the state or national register is required by statute. The laws that created those funds, what the exact idea behind that being. I think it takes out a part of the process of determining whether a property is indeed historic before the application process. It's already known before an application is submitted. But yeah, I'd certainly be interested if anyone else had thoughts about that.
I mean, you have to draw a line somewhere. And I guess state national register listing is the most objective way we have to do that. That theoretically there is a set of 5 objective criteria that can be applied to determine whether or not a building is historic. And a lot of us are bouncing state and national register listing, kind of using those together. And for the most part, if you get a building on the national register, it's also on that state's state register. I think there are some limited cases where that's not the case, but those are in obscure states we don't worry about here, out west. So.
Any thoughts, Colleen and Caitlin, about trade-offs to designation in New York that you often get? Questions about those?
I don't know, Caitlin, you wanna?
So if we're, and again, just to remind folks about the distinction between local designation through your local municipality zoning code versus state national register. The state national register one is the one that's purely honorary. The local designation through your municipality zoning code, that's where you get restrictions as to what, and you have to have a permit to be able to do usually exterior work. So if we're talking about the pros and cons of local designation, you know, I've had congregations here in Rochester that have chosen because of their, you know, voluntarily, not even necessarily to get access to funding, to designate their building, their sanctuary, because they want to protect and preserve it for posterity if, you know, down the road, you know, unfortunately, they are no longer the owners of that property. And, you know, it really is up to you, your particular situation, your particular community to kind of decide if that's a good tool for you. You know, is there a lot of development pressure in your community? Do you want to have that added layer of review? You know, the advantages of it is it does often helps make projects, quote unquote, better projects. So, you know, you're getting kind of free advice from this local body of folks who often have expertise in architecture and design. But what I would say is if you're kind of weighing that, or maybe you've heard like really bad horror stories about local designation or the National Register, you know, people come to us all the time with things that they've heard, you know, oftentimes that aren't 100% true or accurate. You know, it kind of becomes a game of telephone. I would say go to your local preservation organization, go to Colleen, come to myself, go to Preservation Connecticut, and just ask those questions and say, listen, we've heard XYZ, and they can help you kind of weigh the pros and cons of like, well, is there advantage to local designation? Or should we just pursue National Register? What are, you know, what's the potential downsides? There isn't necessarily one. It really depends on your local circumstance. But they're a great we are great resources to help you kind of objectively weigh the actual facts.
And there's a question in the Q&A that I think illustrates this really well. Heather Moody asks, you mentioned not being able to replace a slate roof with asphalt shingles if on historic register. That's not what I said. What I said was, if you're locally designated, and, you know, emphasizing the difference between National Register listing and local designation. So local designation is where you get the design review, where a historic district commission can review a materials change. If you're locally designated, there should be a financial hardship clause in that designation to help when a site can't reasonably afford to do that. But for National Register listing, there's no prevention on that. You know, it's just a pat on the back. We like your building, we like your building's history, and we're putting it on a list. And in fact, for our grant program, there have been a few instances where we've approved a grant to assist with a roof replacement that involved a materials change, that involved a loss of slate to asphalt, or involved a loss of a wood shingle roof to asphalt. Our thinking being that it's more important for your building to have a roof than it is to have a slate roof.
I think that was a good answer, Colleen. Thank you. And I just want to plug the idea that even small grants, $10,000, $50,000, what's often called a planning grant, to complete something like a building conditions assessment, which is just a genre of technical, you know, assessment. Someone's coming out, a firm, an engineering firm, architecture firm, looking closely at your building, can help really diagnose some of the causes of what's going on that can contribute to a decision before you make that replacement. So those are really powerful, and why we always emphasize, if you can seek funding to complete that kind of assessment documentation work in advance, and then think about capital projects, you're oftentimes better off.
Mhm. Right. And another question, could we be on the national or state register without being a local landmark? Yes, you can. Both of those designations can run separately or concurrently. It depends on the particular instance. And let me also say, getting listed on the national register does not automatically mean that your community is going to say, we're going to get you on the local. We're going to designate you locally too. In fact, it might be seen as a way to, oh, okay, well, you're listed on the national register. Maybe you're not under as much of a preservation threat because you've acknowledged your history. It could be a way that it might lessen the pressure to locally designate a building.
Maddie, have we missed any of the questions?
I think we've covered most of them pretty well. And I'll take this as an opportunity to remind everyone that we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar. And you'll also be able to find it on our YouTube channel. If you registered for this event, we'll also send along with the recording the emails and contact information of all of our panelists. I think a lot of these questions can be really complicated for anyone without a preservation background, which, to out myself, I do not have one. So it can kind of take like a helping hand, and some of these conversations can definitely be continued by reaching out to any of our wonderful panelists that were with us today.
Right. There was also a question about exterior versus interior designation, whether a local commission can determine what can be done internally or only externally. Some communities, like New York City, for example, does have a process by which they can designate an interior. The city cannot designate the interior of a religious building because of constitutional issues. But let's just say you don't have a religious building and you have an amazing interior. The lobby of the Empire State Building, for example, has an interior designation. Those buildings generally need to be accessible in some way to the public. And there must be some public benefit to the designation, and it has to be exceptional. Like for me, the Empire State Building is just like Art Deco, like the best example of Art Deco lobby probably in the world. So it would be, and most communities don't have that clause to designate an interior. So I don't think that's going to be, I can't think of one historic religious building in New York with a designated interior, mostly because you can't do it. And I'm not sure what the benefit of it would be. So even local designation, they're not going to say you can't paint your walls inside, you can't take out your pews. That's probably of most concern to a religious building. You can't put in a new sound system.
Yeah, in the state of Connecticut, the local historic district, which is a state statute, is only exterior review. So they can't review your interior.
Mm-hmm.
And usually even then it's only public facing. So anything in the rear of the building is fair game as long as it doesn't obstruct any views.
So it looks like we have one last question. We have time. We have 2 minutes left, and it's from Elizabeth Swenson. It's directed to no one, so I'll direct it to everyone. If a church is in a city with a high poverty rate, but the church itself is not in the poorest neighborhood, but services the community, is that a problem in terms of funding?
Not for us. No. And we fund things that are not in high poverty areas in New York State. It's just an interesting exercise for us to look at where we're giving our grants.
I think depending on the funding source, but even then you would have to be going after funding that is specifically for low income areas or high poverty areas. So most preservation money does not work by those metrics. But if it's coming from somewhere else, that might be different.
I think maybe behind the question is this point, which I'll just emphasize, is you're getting these grants because you're providing some value to your community, right? It can be through your ministries related to like that food pantry grant that we mentioned earlier. It could just be the aesthetic value of the exterior of your property. But in general, the more you can demonstrate the value you're providing to the community, the more competitive you are to any of these grant programs.
Right, that port, the church that Caitlin showed at the end, they told us they had 20 active members, but their services and activities served 875 people outside of their membership. So do the math. You know, the impact is much further than just the people who come on the weekends.
Okay, it's 1:15. I want to give you all a round of applause. Thank you very much for being with us here today at this lunch hour. It was really informative. As Maddie said, we're going to make sure all the registrants to the webinar will receive the transcripts. The video link will be available as well, and that will include the email contact information. So thanks for being here with us. To all the audience members, thanks for attending. Thanks for being more informed and helping your congregation. So we really applaud you and hope to see you again soon with another webinar. So please follow along.